Hi everyone. So this video is going to be about logic models and its connection to how we develop and then implement evaluation questions. So let's get into it here. So what we'll do is we'll just talk about sort of the different components of a logic model. We'll talk about how they sort of connect to evaluation questions, and then we'll spend just a few minutes talking about the weekly assignment for this week. So let me just orient you real quick to sort of where we are in the semester. We spent a few weeks talking about single system designs, and that's the function of that really is to think about how a social worker, one social worker working with one client, is impacting whatever that target variable or target problem is. A program evaluation, on the other hand, is really talking about how the efforts of many social workers would be evaluated. So maybe there's a group of social workers working with a number of clients. Maybe there's a program that, again, maybe employs a bunch of social workers or human service professionals that's responsible for administering benefits of some kind, or distributing aid of some kind, or something like that. So we sort of make a distinction between practice evaluation and program evaluation, and that distinction is sort of along the same fault lines as what constitutes practice and what constitutes a program. So this is really the first in a series of lectures where we're going to be talking about program evaluation. In other words, how does something impact a group of clients, a group of consumers, and really by extension some kind of social problem. So the sort of cornerstone of effective evaluation is really understanding the program, what resources it has, what its main activities are, and then what it hopes to achieve. And the what it hopes to achieve piece can sort of be divided into for whom it's intended to impact, and when or how long it takes to sort of achieve that impact. And really, the point here is that a logic model helps us to sort of do that. So a logic model is really nothing more than a description of a program. It's often used for planning a program, although I should just pause and say, although in an ideal world, I suppose, a logic model would be done before a program is ever organized and designed and constructed. That's not often the case. A lot of times people will sort of do logic models of existing programs. And in fact, that's one of the things that we'll do as an assignment, is sort of think about how an existing program would sort of fit into the framework of a logic model. And it's a diagram, and it sort of provides a picture of the process of the way a program works. Now, the one thing I will say is that a logic model sounds intimidating because it includes the word logic, but it's really not. A logic model is sort of this oversimplified and linear view of how a program takes resources, engages with clients, and achieves whatever it is. So it's oversimplified, and it's highly imperfect, but nevertheless, it's a useful tool for just thinking about what a program looks like. The other thing to note is that logic models really aren't sort of static things. They are actually dynamic, and so the best programs update logic models regularly, or at least think about sort of the suitability of their logic models from time to time. All right, so the different components of a logic model. Typically, the different components of a logic model are some kind of problem statement, some type of goal, which is usually a resolution of the problem in the problem statement. And then the resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes. That's sort of the heart of the logic model. And it's those four things that are sort of organized in a linear fashion, and sort of describe the picture of the program and what it's doing. So let me just adjust my screen here real quick. this is sort of what a basic model, basic logic model looks like. This is sort of very, very generic. But let's walk through it. So at the very top of the screen, we see a problem statement. And then we see the goal sort of right below that. And then organized sort of across the bottom of the page are the resources that the program possesses, the activities, what the program does, these things called the outputs, which are sort of the results or the consequences of the program, of the program activities, and then the outcomes. So what changes as a result of the outputs? There's an arrow that sort of links outcomes back to goal, and that's because it often takes a couple of cycles, right? There's sort of a feedback loop that exists between program activities and goal. But ideally, what should happen is those outcomes over time are sort of helping a program achieve or realize its goal. So let's just walk through these one more time. So a problem statement is really just a description of a problem that the program seeks to solve, and it could be just about anything. I mean, it could be something, it could be something related to food, food scarcity or something like that. And it could be something as complex as improving the health status or a health indicator of a community or something like that. The goal then is really the intended impact of the program, and so it might be an increase in whatever health indicator we were talking about in the problem statement, or it might be a reduction in hunger if that's sort of the problem statement that we were going on. So then the resources are all of the sort of tangible and intangible things a program possesses to execute its mission. So it's often people, it's often expertise possessed by people, it's the time that they have, the materials, the funds, a building, or many buildings, maybe a van or series of vans, if transportation is related to something like this. The activities are simply the actions a program takes to achieve its desired results. And so that's really thinking about putting those resources into action. So in the context of, say, a program that was intended to reduce hunger, one of the resources a program like that might have would be sort of a warehouse full of food, maybe solicited through donations or bought for a low price from a supplier or something like that. And the activity would, and let me say one more thing about resources. And so presumably if a program was distributing food, they'd have a warehouse, maybe some tables, some shelves, to organize all this food. They'd have some people who would stock shelves and then pull things off of shelves and sort of package it for consumers or something like that. They might be volunteers, they might be paid, that's something that any specific program could specify. But then the activity would be simply distributing that food, right? It would be distributing it to people who sort of showed up and made a request for food. Outputs then are the tangible sort of direct products of program activities. So again, in the context of a program that distributed food, the way to think about outputs would be to ask yourself, what is the consequence or what's the product of simply distributing food? And that's that people now have food to eat, to cook with, to be able to feed others with. And then that in turn impacts an outcome, which is a reduction in hunger, or in this particular case. But the outcomes sort of broadly are the changes expected from a program, and often those changes occur among a group of clients or a community, or something of that nature. So in this case, the outcome would be a reduction in hunger and maybe a simultaneous increase in well-being or something like that. So again, the thing I want to emphasize here, just before we go on to the next slide, is the logic models really are sort of this this oversimplified view of a program and what it does. In my experience, the most difficult parts to identify are the outputs and the outcomes. So what I often do when I put together logic models is sort of link outputs directly to activities. So what happens as a result of the activities a program undertakes. And then the outcome is sort of the long-term effects of a program's activities. What change in a problem or sort of dependent variable do we hope to see? So moving on here. So why do we use logic models? I mean, again, they're useful for sort of planning programs and managing programs. They're often really good at sort of facilitating communication between the various stakeholders involved with a program. So stakeholders might be, you know, anything from a board of directors to managers and frontline workers, might be funders, might be an accrediting body, might be consumers, that kind of thing. But it sort of provides, maybe a snapshot is a good word, but a sort of snapshot of what a program possesses in terms of resources and then what it does. It's often useful for sort of consensus building, which sort of fits nicely with that facilitating communication piece. And then logic models are often very useful for fundraising because people sort of understand the resources that a program has, but then the change it hopes to achieve as well. And because really logic models or good logic models sort of fit on a single page, they often do a very good job at communicating what a program's about concisely to funders or people who might think about donating. So let's talk next about how logic models link to process evaluations and outcome evaluations. Now, we haven't talked about either process or outcome evaluations for a few weeks. We would have mentioned these probably back somewhere around week 2 when we started to introduce some of the key concepts for this semester. So let's just pause for a second and talk about what process and outcome evaluations are. So an outcome evaluation is sort of exactly what it sounds like. What changes as a result of the program? What impact does it have? Okay. That's also called a summative evaluation because it typically occurs sort of at the end, right? Which is that summative summary sort of link. A process evaluation asks if the activities are getting us to those outcomes. And so maybe the activities of a program, maybe one of the things we need to ask is if these activities are sort of being run like we thought they were being run. We might ask in a process evaluation if or what the experience of clients is like as they progress through a program. An outcome evaluation then sort of by contrast would ask sort of what changes as a result of their involvement with the program. So moving on, let me just advance my slide. So let's, again, what we're talking about here is let's talk about how the logic model links to sort of the process evaluation and the outcome evaluation. And so one of the things that is useful is that the logic model asks, so one of the components is really this problem statement. And again, that's sort of articulating the problem that the program hopes to address. So I'm going to give you an example here, and just to pause for a second, this example sort of maps onto the Word document that contains a sample logic model in this week's module. So this language is sort of the same. I've just sort of pulled it off of that Word document for these next couple of slides. So the example that we're going to use is The south side of this, again, this is made up like, sort of all of the examples in this class are. But so here's the problem. The south side neighborhood has a high incidence of births to teens. Because of improper or poor prenatal care, babies are experiencing basically problematic development. So these babies are disproportionately underachieving developmental milestones. So the goals, which is sort of that box that existed underneath the problem statement, is sort of the solution to the problem statement. So if we use the example from the previous slide, the goal we might articulate would be babies born to pregnant teens would exhibit better developmental outcomes. So notice in this example we're sort of focusing on the latter of the two problems. Some people might argue that the better solution would be to change teen pregnancy, but what that doesn't do is help the infants who would be born sort of now, right? Because that would be a thing that would take some time to change. So in general, goals should sort of follow that SMART format, and that's some of the stuff we're going to get into a little bit later on. But it should specify the target population served by the program, and it should be sort of a general statement about what the intended result of the program is. So the resources then, again, these are all the things that are sort of available to a program in order for it to execute its objectives or sort of fulfill its mission. So we'll get to the example here in a second, but common types of resources are human capital, financial capital, space, technology. I think I mentioned transportation a couple of slides ago, but sort of the expertise of people would be part of that. Computers and servers and websites and all that fun stuff is part of it as well. So yeah. Resources, sometimes the tendency with logic models is to make resources more complex than they really are. But again, it's sort of all of the tangible and intangible things that a program would possess. So one of the tricks here is to sort of balance specificity with sort of add specificity, but not too much specificity. So it's probably not specific enough to say staff, but it's probably a little bit too specific to say, 3 full-time staff who work 30 hours per week for 52 weeks. I would sort of balance the two of those and say, 3 full-time MSW staff or something like that, or even something like 90 hours a week of paid staff time or something like that. And so that's obviously what this example says here, 3 full-time MSW staff. So moving on, so that next box is talking about activities. So what are sort of the action steps that a program takes to sort of execute its mission? And so when you're doing this, you're sort of thinking about all of the day-to-day activities that a program takes as sort of a matter of course, or as part of its sort of daily business. And the activities box is really a listing of these activities. Some people think of it as sort of leveraging the resources. So how do we use the resources that we listed in the previous box in order to achieve the goals? So some of the common activities might be developing products or actually providing services. And so, what does it look like when a client comes in for a therapy session or to sort of obtain some kind of resources or something like that? A couple of examples of activities here. might be something like providing family planning education. Again, this sort of makes use of the Southside teen pregnancy example, where the babies are sort of experiencing some developmental problems. But maybe there's some mentoring that happens, right? Maybe some kind of counseling that occurs sort of at an individual level or a group level. And of course, one of the other things that a program would have to do, if we were sort of modeling or doing a logic model of this Southside teen pregnancy thing, is that staff would have to identify pregnant teens in order to participate in the program. Then they'd have to enroll them, right? Then they'd have to actually engage in the service provision, whatever that would sort of look like, whether it was mentoring or counseling or something like that. So then outputs. Outputs are sort of these deliverables or these units of service. So what changes, I'm sorry, that's outcomes. So what is sort of the consequence of the activity? So what happens when the activities are completed? These are the things that sort of lead to those desired outcomes. And so here's an example from, again, this sort of fictitious Southside example that I'm using. The pregnant teens would attend classes offered by whatever this program is that we're calling, where they would complete therapy sessions, or they would complete mentoring sessions, right? Maybe they would complete homework if that was sort of, part of what the intervention model looked like. My experience with putting together outputs is that people like to overthink them, and that's sort of a trap that I don't want anyone to fall into. So it's what happens when the activities are completed. A couple of examples here. Maybe classes are taught or meetings are held, right? Materials are developed or materials are distributed. Participants are served in whatever capacity that looks like. There's X number of hours of service provided, or maybe there's client contact hours sort of reported or something like that. A few others up here, focus groups might be held, or a policy briefing would be conducted. Notice there's a verb in sort of all of these things that occurs in the past tense. That's one of the secrets to sort of putting together a list of outputs. Maybe a curriculum is developed, or a counseling session is held, or a lobbying session is held, something like that. The outcomes, now this is the fun part, right? Because this is sort of thinking about what changes as a result of the resources being put into action in the activities, what those completed activities look like in the outputs. The outcomes really ask what's changed as a result of this. And that's typically observed by an increase in something, or a decrease in some kind of problem or something like that. Outcomes are really about change, right? So there's a change in knowledge, right? There's a change in skill. There's a change in motivation or something like that. And so again, going back to the Southside teen pregnancy example, we might say something like, the pregnant teen participants demonstrate knowledge of prenatal nutrition and health guidelines. Or another example might be, pregnant teen participants exhibit knowledge about where to access certain resources or prenatal care or something like that. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, here's another example. Maybe pregnant teens demonstrate knowledge of appropriate appropriate child rearing practices, or they're able to sort of demonstrate these behaviors, or we're actually able to observe them engaging in these kinds of behaviors or something like that. Might also be sort of a change in condition. And so that might be something like the children of participating mothers sort of demonstrate developmental milestones that are consistent with with those from families who are not vulnerable. So that changes it from sort of the mothers to the children, but that would be something that would absolutely be appropriate to include in a logic model, right? So maybe another way to think about this would be a decrease in the developmental gap between children of these pregnant teens that we're using in this example, and children born to some other demographic group of people or something like that. Okay. We often will sort of orient outcomes into short-term outcomes and then long-term outcomes, and just by way of explanation, a short-term outcome is sort of what changes immediately or in the near future, and a long-term outcome obviously is what happens over time. There really is no sort of guideline about what constitutes a short-term outcome and what constitutes a long-term outcome. That's really done sort of in the context of the program. So again, in this pregnant teen example that we're using, a short-term outcome might be a change in knowledge that occurs over the course of a couple of weeks. A long-term outcome might be some developmental milestone that the child reaches, at age 3 or 4 or 5 or something like that. But again, these outcomes are sort of oriented in the context of the program. So it's up to the person or group of people developing the logic model to sort of specify what constitutes short-term and what constitutes long-term. So this slide is about sort of differentiating between outputs and outcomes. One of the things that can be tough, and this is certainly true in my experience with helping people develop logic models, is that outputs are often conflated with outcomes. So typically the exercise that I engage in is to think about an output as what's the product of a program's activities. And then an outcome is what changes as a result of those outputs. And I've listed a couple of examples here on the slide. I think one of the tricks with doing logic models is to sort of go step by step by step and not make too much of a leap between any two links in the resources, activities, output, outcome chain of things. So sort of take it step by step, and even if that step feels really small. So here's the example that is on UB Learns in the Word document as well. This is again, it's in a Word document, so it looks a little bit different than what's on this screen here, but the text is by and large the same. So I just put the title of the program at the top, calling this sort of a generic Southside Children's Agency prenatal program. And the problem statement, this is similar to what was on the slide a couple of minutes ago. So here's the problem statement. The Southside neighborhood has a high incidence of birth to teens. Because of improper prenatal care, these babies disproportionately disproportionately underachieve the developmental milestones. So the goal is sort of in reference to that problem statement. And the way I phrased it here is that babies born to pregnant teens in Southside will exhibit better developmental outcomes. Another way to phrase it might be to reduce the gap between the children born in Southside, relative to some other group or something like that. But again, so then in the sort of second half of the slide here, I've organized the different sort of phases of the logic model. Again, these are just sort of columns, organized vertically, and we proceed from left to right. So we've got resources that lead to activities, activities lead to outputs, outputs lead to short-term outcomes, and then short-term outcomes lead to long-term outcomes. So let's just talk about this for a second. So some of the resources that the Southside Children's Agency possesses, maybe an MSW program manager, a part-time RN instructor, maybe a collection of certified education materials, maybe some videos, maybe some teaching tools. That might be something like a TV and a DVD player, or maybe a computer and a projector, loaded with PowerPoint or something like that. Some of the things you might list in here, is support from, some agency that funds or some, governmental agency that funds programs to do this kind of work. Maybe something like telephones and answering machines so that scheduling can happen, that kind of thing. Maybe a traveling chalkboard or something like that, if that was something that was necessary. So activities then are the things that sort of the verbs, right? The thing that a program would do in order to achieve its outcomes. So in this example, maybe a partnership between the agency and the high school first identifies pregnant teens and makes referrals to the program. And then the staff of the program provide classes to the participants, and maybe we say those classes are held twice a week for an hour or something like that. The outputs would be sort of what happens when the activities are completed. So in this example, I've listed pregnant teens attend classes offered by the program. That's the only one I've listed, but there could be others. Maybe they complete homework. Maybe they interact with the materials. Maybe they complete tests if sort of that was part of the curriculum. So then outcomes, again, I've divided these into short and long term, but maybe a short-term outcome might be something like a pregnant teen demonstrates knowledge of nutrition guidelines, or pregnant teens adhere to some nutrition guideline or something like that. A long-term outcome would maybe be something that occurs in the infant's life, say 12 months after it's born. Maybe that 12-month milestone for motor skills is sort of developmentally appropriate, or sort of aligned with whatever the developmental guidelines are. So that's sort of one example. You'll have a chance over the next couple of weeks to sort of think about a logic model for some program with which you're familiar. And it's hopefully going to be interesting to sort of think about a program in that context. So let's spend a few minutes talking about how we develop evaluation questions for our program. And so really the requisite task here is to talk about how outcomes sort of articulated in a logic model are made into evaluation questions. And so the thing to, went too far. So the thing to do here is to sort of look at the outputs and the outcomes. And in my mind, really, the outcomes are sort of more important. And really, so making the leap from sort of a logic model to an outcome evaluation is really about asking, did the program achieve its outcomes? So did that variable, did that target problem change as a result of the sort of resources and the activities and the outputs? And of course, when we think about evaluation goals, we like to think about SMART goals. We'll talk about this in a second here. When we're thinking about sort of SMART goals, that's what helps us sort of make the leap, or make the leap into evaluation questions a little bit more manageable. So the SMART, SMART is an acronym for the different sort of qualities a goal should possess. Goals should be specific. So that is to say that a goal should be sort of simple, concise, and explicit. It should be measurable. So it's clear to anyone who asks it's clear to anyone who asks whether or not the goal was achieved. So oftentimes a goal might be evaluated on its measurability in terms of success or failure. Either you met it or you didn't. Maybe there's a sort of 1 through 10 scale or something like that. The A stands for achievable, and that's that it's realistic. It's sort of within the realm of the abilities of a client, or within the realm of the abilities of a program. You can think about it, achievable goals all the time. Sort of in sort of the goals we set for ourselves, and oftentimes achievable means dividing big goals into much smaller things. And for as useful as that is for things that we do for ourselves, it's useful for clients as well. The R stands for relevant, so it should be sort of a key component of what an agency or a program needs to achieve its mission. And then the T stands for time bound. And that simply means that the goal sort of contains a time frame. Maybe it's a week, maybe it's a month, maybe it's a year, something like that. Again, these are all sort of done in the context of the program. There isn't sort of some objective standard for SMART goals. So let's back this into the example, the Southside pregnant teens example. So if the output is something like pregnant teens attend prenatal classes conducted by the program, making that into a SMART goal might look something like this. During this first 6 months of fiscal year 2013, again, I just sort of picked a year at random, 200 teens will attend the Southside Children's Agency prenatal program. Again, that's presuming that there's sort of enough need for a program like this. And in many respects, 200 was a number I just sort of picked out of thin air. But again, it should be in the context of a program. But this one sort of does exhibit all of the SMART qualities. So it's specific, it's measurable. So this goal does sort of exhibit all of the sort of different dimensions of what a SMART goal entails. So it's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant, and it's time bound. So just to sort of talk about each of those things, right? The specific piece means that it's concise and sort of shortly stated, which this one is, right? It's measurable, which is that 200 piece. So this is, if there were any fewer than 200, that would be failure. Any, 200 or more, that would be successful. It's achievable. Again, that's presuming that there's sort of a commensurate level of need with 200 teens. It's relevant because it sort of helps the agency fulfill its mission, and it's time bound, right? So that first 6 months piece is sort of contained in there. So making the leap from sort of SMART goals to evaluation questions is as simple as restating the goal as a question. So for example, we could take the output piece from the previous slide, which was that 200 teens would complete the classes. And we could simply make it into a question and ask something like, how many teens attended prenatal programming during the first 6 months of fiscal year 2013? And we might do that by reviewing agency records or sign-in sheets or something like that. And we would actually be able to answer that pretty quickly if we had sign-in sheets, right? Or if we had a record of how many books were distributed, right? If the program materials were sort of contained in a book. Okay, so here's a second example. So in this example, we'll take this outcome, we'll make it SMART, and then we'll turn it into an evaluation question. So the outcome we'll use here for this example is pregnant teens are knowledgeable about prenatal nutrition and health guidelines. So how might we, let me get to advance the slide. So let's talk about how we might make this sort of a SMART goal. So we might say something like, during fiscal year 2013, 50% of teens attending the prenatal program will report an increase in knowledge of prenatal health and nutrition guidelines. Again, you could sort of modify this however you felt was appropriate. Maybe 50% of the teens will report a 50% increase in knowledge, or and then 40% will demonstrate a 25% increase in knowledge. So there's sort of different ways to do this, but again, I think this is coming through. And then so moving this into an evaluation question might look something like this. We might ask how many teens attending the prenatal program demonstrated an increase in knowledge of prenatal health and nutrition during whatever fiscal year we were doing this in. And then sort of the step after this would be designing survey questions, right, and evaluation questions. And in this example, it would be sort of figuring out how do we measure knowledge of the prenatal health and nutrition guidelines. So here's again the logic model, and the thing that I've appended sort of to the bottom of this is these goals and outcomes in terms of SMART goals and SMART questions, and this is again on UB Learns for you to reference, and I hope that'll be useful as we move into the logic model assignment due in a couple of weeks as well. So the assignment for this week is sort of in preparation for the logic model assignment, which I think is in a week or two from now. But we're just going to talk about the different components of a logic model. And you can use any program that you want. It should be a program that you're familiar with. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything that's local to you. But again, as long as it's something that you're familiar with, I think you can use it for this assignment. The details are on UB Learns. Again, you're always welcome, obviously, to email or get in touch with me. But this is sort of the practice for the bigger logic model assignment in a couple of weeks. And really the task here is just going to be to identify how the different components of a logic model fit in with whatever program it is that you're picking. So, all right, that's it. Thanks for watching.